Yeah, so that makes me think about like one, like so Zach Bitter, even when he's in ketosis probably almost all the time, but he still adds carbohydrates during his, like say, 100-mile world record or something, where there's longer runs and workouts and stuff. But then like on the other end of the spectrum, as far as carbohydrate intake goes, you'll see someone in the ultra running world like David Roche, who's kind of like this hot, like whatever hot item right now, if you want to say it that way or whatever, where he ran, set the, or broke the course record at the Leadville Trail 100, which was a record that was held for years and years and years. And that's at altitude, obviously. Like Leadville's at 10.5, like it's super high up there. Then he turned around, and I guess it was like 3 or 4 months later, and ran heavily, which is a flat, low elevation desert race in Phoenix. And he did the same like high carb intake the entire time. And so my question is related to like what you were just saying is like essentially, so he's doing super high carb. Is that actually preserving any muscle glycogen, or is he just like breaking down a ton and then keeping his glucose levels high and preventing hyperglycemia? Like, kind of what's going on there if you're doing 90, 120, or even like he did a workout the other day where he was doing 140 grams an hour, only for 1 hour, not during a race, but still these like massively high intakes of carbohydrates is just like mind blowing to me. So, like, kind of like what's going on there, I guess.
Yeah. So Derek, let's first differentiate the David Roches of the world versus everyone else. And we've had some interesting exchanges with David on Twitter and X about this exact study and some of his thoughts on it. All I will say is the David Roches of the world, or the elite level athletes, the world class athletes, they're not they're a 0.00001% of the population. Okay, they're also often metabolically distinct and unique. So if you look for guidance and advice from the 0.00001% or less, and expect that guidance to apply to you, even though we know they're metabolically distinct due to their exercise training volumes over time and potentially genetic variables, which allow them to have the capacity to reach such high levels of performance, no matter how much training they're doing. There's a difference between LeBron James and everyone else. Not saying David Roche is LeBron James. I'm just saying that there are unique factors in some individuals that distinguish them from everyone else, no matter how much you train. And so what they're doing probably should not necessarily apply to 99% of people who are listening here, because that's a distinct phenotype, okay, metabolic phenotype. But maybe it does, Derek. So let's dive into that. So there's actually been some case reports, and we talked about this a little earlier, and let's dive into it a bit more, where they've actually taken world-class triathletes. So actually, at the time, this athlete happened to be the second place finisher, and went into a laboratory setting and actually completed an Ironman at a world record time. So what that gave the opportunity is look at what happens in an Ironman competitor completing a world record time, sub 8 hours, and actually hit that world record time in the lab. What happens to them? Now, this athlete happened to be consuming 80 grams of carbohydrates per hour, but shifted towards predominant fat oxidation throughout the exercise bout. So shifted away from carb oxidation and towards fat oxidation, despite loading up high amounts of carbohydrates, and was maintaining performance despite that overall metabolic shift away from carbohydrate oxidation. That should tell us something. That tells us that this idea that fat oxidation or carb oxidation is essential for performance is absolutely challenged, even at the most elite level. Like the best in the world, we're seeing shifts away from carbohydrate oxidation towards fat during long duration exercise bout and maintaining levels of power performance output. So that's number one. But when someone starts ingesting that high of level of carbohydrates, there's well-known literature that carbohydrates cause at high levels, north of 60 to 90 grams, can cause GI distress during exercise. Okay. And this is whole field of what they call gut training. So just training to be able to ingest excessive amounts of carbohydrates during exercise to be able to maintain this excessive level. That is almost certainly not an important consideration for the vast majority of people who just want to perform at a very high level and maintain their health. If you were at the very tip of performance and you want to do everything to optimize performance, Now you may be making these considerations. So the question is, in a hypothetical sense, should David Roche be consuming, whatever it is, 140, 160 grams per hour to maintain that level of performance? There's only one way to know for David, and that's to try multiple approaches in an exercise laboratory setting to actually see what's happening not only to his muscle glycogen, but also his substrate oxidation. Because the reality is that what the historical evidence across the vast majority of people who've ever been studied is this: just by providing more and more forms of exogenous carbohydrates, that these individuals are just shifting away from fat oxidation. And we know that these athletes are able to shift towards fat oxidation, or these low carb athletes are on very high levels of fat oxidation right out the get-go, and they maintain equivalent levels of performance. So it doesn't seem to align with the current evidence that would be required. But then this brings up a different question, Derek, which is, why would anyone change? Like, why would David ever even consider changing? Why would David Roche change? Well, one, he doesn't need to, because you can do any form of diet, right, and perform equivalently, at least based on the evidence we're showing. But there's one major caveat. When we look at the data in our own study, it isn't like everyone's performing better on one diet or the other. There's some are performing better on high carb and some are performing better on low carb. You will never know whether you perform better on high carb or low carb unless you try. And the vast majority of people won't try because they're told they must do a certain type of approach to maintain performance, despite the evidence now emerging that shows that if you habituate to either diet long enough, you'll maintain performance. So many people won't even have that opportunity to try, particularly at the very high level where there's more risk involved, right? Someone like David, you bring his name up, he's known because of his performance, right? He wasn't running these world record times. People may not be even aware of him. And so that leaves a level of pressure. So why try something different if whatever I'm doing right now seems to work? And the only reason someone might is one, evidence, and evidence you have to be open-minded to. Keep in mind that what you're initially taught is much easier to believe than when someone challenges those initial thoughts. It's much harder to change a belief than to induce a belief. And so yeah, the average person has to consider a number of things. And it's the cost to benefit ratio. Do you want to try and attempt to get to 140 grams per hour? Almost certainly you don't need that. In fact, most individuals, someone like David Roche, his ability to maintain a percentage of his VO2 max even at higher levels is different, is distinct from someone else. And when you talk about someone like a Zach Bitter or someone else, they're doing these ultra marathons. They're usually maintaining VO2 maxes that are lower than even the study we looked at. Lower than 70% of VO2 maxes, especially for these multi-hour events. And so again, it's context dependent. It depends on the environment. But what someone like David Roche is doing is not necessarily what most people should be doing. What they're doing might be distinct to what's working for them, but they might not even know what's best for them because they might not have tried multiple other approaches. And I will tell you this, one thing that has always come up is this idea of, I tried a low carb diet, it didn't work for me. And that might be true. Awesome. You tried it. It didn't work for you. The only problem is that the vast majority of athletes, so I've worked with some elite level athletes, I've coached a number of there's an ultra marathon racer, some elite level athletes across diverse sports, some people who aren't elite athletes. Everyone's different. Everyone is very, very different in how they respond to this. And it really requires a unique practitioner with some level of awareness on how to help guide someone on that journey to understand with minimizing risk on whether this may be an applicable approach to them or not. But yeah, so someone and like Derek, he almost makes a joke out of it. Like, hey, look, I'm pushing like 500 grams of carbohydrates this 30 minutes. It's almost like a fun game. And I think he's just doing it to be tongue in cheek. I actually don't know him personally, to be fully honest. He seems like a great guy though. And he runs fast. That's for damn sure. But yes, I would challenge based on the current evidence that is even remotely necessary. I think the idea of just pushing more and more and more, historically, it just shifts around what's being used. And in fact, the higher the levels go, the more rapid the muscle glycogen breakdown appears to be, relatively speaking.